The rice tariffication law may have caused its own problems, but it sure did help solve one: inflation. That gave the central bank some space to reverse last year's back-to-back rate hikes. And just when most economies around the world needed a nudge from monetary policymakers. Here's a story.
This year's inflation story was a complete reversal of last year's. From a 9-year high of 6.7% in October 2018, inflation finally tapered to within the government target band for the most part of 2019. Such a benign environment gave the BSP room to loosen policy thrice this year, after hiking benchmark rates by a cumulative 175 basis points last year. The first cut came in May, after first quarter growth was dragged to a fresh 4-year low. The BSP decided it best to cut rates by 25 bips, considering the impact of the budget delay on economic activity. After all, inflation wasn't an issue.
We have more confidence about the trajectory of inflation. We can now start normalizing the stance of monetary policy that we decided to tighten last year by a total of 175 basis points.
RRR remained untouched then, with Governor Jokna reiterating that the RRR is not a policy tool. But finally, on May 17, the BSP caved and slashed the reserve requirement ratio by 2 percentage points across 3 tranches. August rolled around and talks on the RRR remained alive. But the Monetary Board said more cuts were best reserved for another time.
We have yet to see the bulk of the liquidity going into bank lending and the economy. But of course, the decision on when to resume the reduction in the requirements is a live discussion at the board.
They did slash the benchmark rate again. Jokna said this was a preemptive move against global weakening and sustained trade tensions. Apparently, though, these global woes weren't compelling enough for a larger 50-bip cut. That being said, Jokna says they're not done cutting for the year. True enough, key rates saw another 25-bip cut in September. That put the benchmark rate at 4%, while the rate on the overnight deposit was slashed to 3.5% and on lending facilities to 4.5%. And in October, a surprise RRR cut placed reserve requirement at 14%, effective on the first week of December. All this as price pressures continued to ease and as the government scrambled to rev up economic growth after disappointing first-half figures. In October, inflation slowed to 0.8%, clocking in at its slowest pace in 3 years. And finally, as if to declare victory over 2 years of battling rising prices, the Monetary Board kept rates steady in its last 2 policy meetings to let previous adjustments work its way into the system. Still, BSP Governor Ben Jokna sought to manage expectations, saying the balance of risks to inflation continued to lean slightly toward the upside in 2020 before traversing to the downside in 2021.
Upside risk to inflation over the near term emanate mainly from first, potential volatility in international oil prices amid geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. Second, potential impact of the African swine fever outbreak. And third, recent weather disturbances on domestic food prices.
But subdued global growth and demand amid the still burgeoning trade war could mitigate these upward pressures. The Monetary Board also retained all inflation projections made during the November policy meeting. That's 2.4% in 2019 and 2.9% for 2020 and 2021.
Inflation is expected to approach the target band after bottoming out in October and settle close to the midpoint of the target by 2020 and 2021 as base effects start to dissipate.
Despite the 14% cut in reserve requirement, though, the bank still saw slower loan growth in October. The Monetary Board says not to worry.
Monetary policy works with a lag. That's why we have to stop at this point and find out how they will respond to the significant cuts in the reserve requirement. So maybe a lag of maybe 6 months to 9 months. That's about 2 to 3 quarters. So we cannot conclude on the basis of what we have seen thus far that there is a slowdown in lending. In fact, the liquidity has increased, but lending has been rather slow in picking up. So we'll allow them to maybe another quarter or two.
Jokna also assured Bloomberg that he hasn't forgotten his promise regarding the RRR.
My promise is that we would cut the reserve requirement single digit by the end of my term, which is 2023.
Definitely, this is one thing to continue watching out for as a new decade begins. That's on top of more easing of about 50 basis points more, as signaled by the BSP governor. After all, the BSP has reiterated time and again that the biggest catalyst for their every decision are still local indicators like GDP and inflation. On top of that, the US Fed signaled that they might just sit out the whole of 2020 and not touch rates. The BSP says that's good news.
It will allow us greater flexibility in terms of setting our policy rate. It will also add boost to the downward trend in further downward trend in interest rate path.
And so, with the Fed uncertainty out of the way and inflation benign, it looks like we can expect the easing cycle to continue in 2020.